has confirmed it's launched an attack on Iran.
At 4:17 in the morning, the radar room aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln was quiet, except for the low hum of electronics and the soft voices of watch officers scanning the skies above the Persian Gulf. Nothing unusual had appeared on the screens for hours. The carrier strike group was operating in what commanders described as a routine patrol pattern, maintaining a steady course through tense but controlled waters. Then a radar operator noticed 4 small returns suddenly appear on the edge of the detection grid. At first, they were just faint blips. Fast, very fast. Within seconds, the contacts were identified as high-speed aircraft climbing rapidly and turning directly toward the carrier group. The computer began calculating their trajectory. The result made the room fall silent. They were heading straight for the Abraham Lincoln. More data began flooding the system. Speed, over 900 kilometers per hour. Altitude, increasing. Formation, tight, tactical spacing. The identification algorithms ran through their library and delivered a likely match. MiG-29 fighters, 4 of them. No flight plan, no radio contact, no warning. The officer of the deck was alerted immediately, and within moments the carrier shifted from quiet watch mode to full combat readiness. Across the massive flight deck, red lights flashed as crew members sprinted into position. Pilots already on standby rushed toward their aircraft. Inside the Combat Information Center, commanders watched the radar tracks redraw themselves in real time. The MiGs were not just passing by. They were descending slightly, adjusting course with precision and accelerating. Whatever their mission was, they were committing to it. The order was given. Launch the interceptors. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets roared down the catapult rails, followed seconds later by 2 more. The sound of their engines shook the deck as they blasted into the dark sky, climbing hard to meet the incoming aircraft long before they could reach the carrier. Now the race had begun. 40 miles apart, 30, 25. Radar locks flickered on and off as both sides began electronic countermeasures. The MiG-29s broke formation, splitting into 2 pairs in a maneuver pilots use when preparing for an aerial engagement. That single move told the American pilots everything they needed to know. This was no accident. The distance closed rapidly. Pilots on both sides now had visual contact. 4 silhouettes cutting through the dawn light. 4 more approaching head-on at nearly twice the speed of sound. What happened next would last less than 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes would become one of the most tense and controversial aerial encounters ever recorded over the Gulf. Missile locks, violent evasive maneuvers, and a split-second decision that could have triggered an international crisis. 4 MiG-29s had chosen to challenge one of the most powerful warships on Earth. But they were about to discover that the sky above the Abraham Lincoln was far from undefended. In the early hours before sunrise, the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln moved steadily through the dark waters of the Persian Gulf, its massive hull cutting through calm seas as part of a routine patrol. The carrier, one of the most powerful warships ever built, was leading a full strike group that included guided missile cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels spread across dozens of miles of ocean. Although the region had seen periods of tension for decades, that night had been unusually quiet. Most of the flight deck lights were dimmed, and only a small number of aircraft remained on alert, their pilots resting nearby in case they were needed. Inside the carrier's Combat Information Center, however, the atmosphere was never truly calm. Dozens of radar screens glowed in the darkness as operators tracked commercial aircraft, distant patrol planes, and the constant movement of ships across the busy Gulf. At approximately 4:17 local time, one of the radar technicians noticed something unusual appearing near the outer edge of the long-range radar coverage. 4 small radar contacts had suddenly emerged from the north, moving at high speed. At first, this wasn't entirely unusual. Military aircraft from several countries frequently flew patrol routes across the region. But within seconds, the system's tracking software began calculating their course and speed, and the data immediately raised concern. The aircraft were flying in a tight tactical formation, and accelerating to nearly 900 kilometers per hour. More importantly, their flight path appeared to be pointing directly toward the carrier strike group. The radar operator alerted his supervisor, and the contacts were quickly flagged for closer analysis. Identification systems attempted to classify the aircraft using radar signatures, speed profiles, and known flight patterns. Within moments, the system returned a probable match: MiG-29 fighters. The aircraft type had been operated by the Iranian Air Force for decades, having been originally purchased from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Though not the newest fighter in the region, the MiG-29 remained a capable air superiority aircraft, with powerful engines, high maneuverability, and advanced short-range missiles. As additional radar sweeps updated the tracks, the situation became even more unusual. The four fighters were not simply passing through international airspace. They were adjusting their formation and gradually descending, a maneuver often used when preparing for visual identification or interception of another aircraft. Yet no communication had been received on standard military frequencies, and no notice of scheduled exercises had been reported through regional coordination channels. The officer on duty immediately notified the bridge and the carrier's tactical command team. Within minutes, the quiet overnight watch aboard the Abraham Lincoln shifted into a more alert posture. Security personnel moved quickly across the ship, and the carrier's air defense systems were quietly brought to a higher readiness level. Several destroyers in the strike group also began adjusting their radar coverage to track the incoming aircraft more precisely. The distance between the fighters and the carrier group was still over 120 miles, but at their current speed, that gap would close quickly. On the flight deck, preparations began for a possible launch of interceptor aircraft. Crew members moved toward several F/A-18 Super Hornets that had been parked in a ready position precisely for situations like this. These fighters, equipped with radar-guided missiles and advanced targeting systems, were designed to intercept unknown aircraft long before they could threaten the carrier itself. Meanwhile, the radar contacts continued to move closer. New data suggested the MiGs had climbed briefly to nearly 30,000 feet before dropping slightly again, perhaps scanning the area with their own onboard radar systems. One intelligence officer later suggested the maneuver might have been an attempt to test the reaction time of the American carrier group, a tactic occasionally used during tense encounters at sea. Another theory, never officially confirmed, was that the fighters were participating in an unscheduled training mission that had taken them dangerously close to the strike group's patrol zone. Whatever the reason, one thing had become clear inside the carrier's command center. 4 Iranian fighters were approaching one of the most powerful warships in the world, and they were doing it fast. The question now facing the crew of the Abraham Lincoln was simple but critical. Were these aircraft merely observing from a distance, or were they about to push the situation much further? The moment the unidentified aircraft were confirmed to be approaching the carrier strike group at high speed, the situation aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln changed from cautious observation to immediate action. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical commander studied the updated radar tracks for only a few seconds before giving the order everyone on watch had been anticipating. Interceptors would be launched. The goal was simple: identify the incoming aircraft visually, establish control of the airspace around the carrier, and ensure that no hostile aircraft could approach within striking distance. On the flight deck, the alert crew had already begun moving even before the official command was broadcast. Aircraft carriers operate with a system known as the Alert 5, meaning certain fighters remain ready to launch within 5 minutes at any time. That morning, 2 F/A-18E Super Hornets were positioned near the forward catapults, armed and fueled, their pilots resting only a short distance away inside the ready room. When the launch order came through, the pilots were already running across the deck in their flight suits, helmets under their arms, guided by the flashing red deck lights and hand signals from the ground crew. The F/A-18E Super Hornet is one of the primary strike fighters used by the United States Navy. Designed for both air superiority and strike missions, it carries advanced radar systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and a wide variety of missiles. For interception duties, The aircraft are typically armed with AIM-120 AMRAAM radar-guided missiles for longer-range engagements, and AIM-9X Sidewinder missiles for close combat. While the approaching aircraft were still many miles away, carrier doctrine required American pilots to meet them far from the fleet, establishing a protective barrier in the sky. Within minutes, the first two Super Hornets were strapped in and powered up. Their twin engines roared to life, sending vibrations across the steel deck. Deck crew in colored jackets moved quickly around the aircraft, performing final safety checks. Fuel lines were disconnected, weapon systems were confirmed armed, and the pilots completed rapid communication checks with the carrier's air traffic controllers. Inside the cockpit of the lead fighter, the pilot began receiving real-time data through the aircraft's tactical display. The 4 incoming radar contacts were now approximately 95 miles away and closing fast. The information link from the carrier allowed the pilots to see the same radar picture being monitored by the strike group's command center, giving them a clear view of the approaching formation. The first jet taxied forward and aligned with the catapult shuttle. A deck officer crouched nearby, giving final signals as steam pressure built within the launch system beneath the deck. When everything was ready, the pilot pushed the engines to full afterburner, the twin exhausts blasting intense heat behind the aircraft. A sharp signal from the catapult officer, and the fighter was gone. In less than 2 seconds, the Super Hornet was hurled from 0 to nearly 160 knots, launching into the darkness ahead of the carrier. The aircraft climbed steeply into the pre-dawn sky, immediately banking toward the north, where the radar contacts continued to approach. Only seconds later, the second fighter launched, followed shortly by 2 additional aircraft prepared as backup interceptors. The carrier now had 4 Super Hornets in the air, forming a defensive patrol line roughly 40 miles away from the strike group. Their mission was not necessarily to engage in combat, but to make it unmistakably clear that the airspace around the Abraham Lincoln was being actively defended. As the fighters climbed toward 25,000 feet, their onboard radars began searching for targets. Within moments, the sensors picked up the incoming aircraft independently, confirming what the carrier's radar operators had already been tracking. The 4 contacts were still maintaining a tight formation, though new data suggested they had begun spreading into pairs, a maneuver commonly used by fighter pilots when preparing for possible engagement. Inside the cockpit of the lead American fighter, the pilot watched the radar display carefully. The distance was shrinking quickly now, 70 miles, then 65. Through the aircraft's secure communication channel, the carrier transmitted updated instructions. Intercept, identify, and if necessary, escort the unknown aircraft away from the strike group's operating area. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles per hour closer with every passing minute, the 4 approaching fighters continued their course. Whether they intended to simply observe, test American reactions, or something more aggressive remained unclear. But in the skies above the Persian Gulf, 2 groups of highly trained fighter pilots were now racing toward each other, and the margin for misunderstanding was rapidly disappearing. The 2 groups of fighters were now closing the distance at a combined speed of well over 1,500 kilometers per hour. The American pilots could already see faint shapes forming on the edge of the horizon through the tinted canopy glass. Modern fighter radars had been tracking the aircraft for dozens of miles, but visual confirmation remained a critical step in any interception. The lead Super Hornet pilot adjusted his course slightly to position his aircraft above and behind the approaching formation, a standard tactic that allowed him to maintain an advantage if the situation escalated. Inside the cockpit, the radar display confirmed what had already been suspected. 4 targets, 2 pairs. Their spacing suggested trained military pilots working in coordination. The MiG-29 is known for its excellent thrust-to-weight ratio and agility, especially in close-range engagements. Although the aircraft design dates back to the Cold War, it remains highly maneuverable and dangerous when flown by experienced pilots. American pilots are trained extensively to deal with aircraft like the MiG-29, studying its flight characteristics and limitations during exercises and simulated engagements. As the distance dropped below 20 miles, both sides now had clear radar locks on each other. Electronic warning tones sounded inside the cockpits as each aircraft detected the other's targeting systems scanning the sky. This did not necessarily mean weapons were about to be fired. Fighter radars constantly sweep nearby aircraft during interceptions. But it did confirm one important detail. Neither side was attempting to hide. The lead American pilot switched briefly to a secure international guard frequency and transmitted a short warning message instructing the approaching aircraft to alter course away from the carrier strike group. The transmission was repeated twice. No response came back. Instead, something unexpected happened. The four MiG-29s suddenly split into two separate elements, each pair turning slightly outward before curving back inward in a maneuver fighter pilots sometimes use to create a pincer approach. The move was aggressive, but not necessarily hostile. It could be interpreted as a tactical positioning exercise, or a deliberate attempt to test how the American pilots would respond. The Super Hornets reacted immediately. The two forward American fighters broke formation as well, each pilot rolling his aircraft sharply and climbing several thousand feet to create vertical separation. This maneuver allowed them to maintain radar coverage while preventing the MiGs from approaching in a straight line. The remaining two Super Hornets held slightly farther back, acting as support aircraft and monitoring the entire engagement through their advanced sensor systems. Within seconds, the calm geometry of the interception dissolved into high-speed maneuvering. One of the MiG-29s accelerated aggressively and pulled into a steep climb, its twin engines leaving a faint trail of exhaust against the brightening sky. The American pilot tracking it matched the maneuver, pushing his aircraft into a tight turn while keeping the radar lock stable. At these speeds, even a small change in direction required immense precision. Both pilots were now experiencing heavy G-forces pressing them into their seats. The distance between the closest aircraft dropped below 5 miles. At this range, visual identification was undeniable. The distinctive twin vertical stabilizers of the MiG-29 became clearly visible against the dawn light. The American pilot could even see the dark shape of the pilot's helmet through the opposing cockpit canopy for a brief moment as the two aircraft passed at a slight angle. For several seconds, neither side fired. Instead, the sky filled with rapid maneuvers as the fighters attempted to gain positional advantage. The MiG-29s relied on their excellent low-speed maneuverability, performing sharp turns designed to force the American aircraft into defensive positions. The Super Hornets, meanwhile, used their advanced radar and targeting systems to maintain awareness of all four opponents at once. Inside the cockpit of the lead Super Hornet, a missile tone briefly sounded as the aircraft's targeting system achieved a stable lock on one of the MiGs. The pilot did not fire. The rules of engagement required clear, hostile intent before weapons could be used, and despite the aggressive maneuvers, the situation had not yet crossed that line. But the margin for error was shrinking. One of the MiG-29s suddenly rolled into a hard descending turn, dropping several thousand feet while accelerating. Another MiG followed, attempting to position itself behind one of the American fighters. The maneuver was fast and well executed, suggesting the pilots had trained extensively for close-range engagements. The American pilot reacted instantly, pulling into a high-G brake turn that forced his aircraft into a tight spiral climb. The Super Hornet's powerful engines allowed it to regain speed quickly as it climbed, and within seconds the pursuing MiG was forced to widen its turn to avoid overshooting. For a brief moment, the fighters were less than 2 miles apart. At that distance, modern air combat becomes a test of reaction time, training, and situational awareness. Both sides were now fully aware that any sudden movement, any unexpected radar lock or missile launch warning, could instantly turn the encounter into a live combat engagement. Back aboard the Abraham Lincoln, radar operators watched the unfolding encounter with growing tension. The radar tracks twisted and overlapped as the aircraft maneuvered at extreme speed. Command officers monitored every movement carefully, prepared to authorize defensive action if necessary. Then came the most dangerous moment of the encounter. One of the MiG-29s briefly locked its radar directly onto a trailing Super Hornet, triggering a missile warning alert inside the American cockpit. For a split second, the pilot prepared to deploy countermeasures. His thumb hovered near the control switch that would release defensive flares and chaff. But just as quickly as the lock appeared, it disappeared. The MiG pilot rolled away, climbing sharply and breaking off the approach. The other 3 aircraft followed within seconds, reforming their formation at a greater distance. Whether the radar lock had been a deliberate warning or simply part of the maneuvering was impossible to know. What was clear was that the confrontation had reached its peak. The American fighters maintained their positions, escorting the 4 MiG-29s as they gradually turned away from the carrier group's airspace. For several long minutes, both formations flew parallel courses, watching each other carefully while maintaining a safe separation. Eventually, the MiGs increased speed and began heading back toward the northern horizon. The encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes, yet during those few intense minutes, 8 highly advanced fighter aircraft had come within moments of turning a tense interception into a real aerial battle above the Persian Gulf. When the 4 MiG-29s finally turned north and accelerated away, the tension that had gripped the skies over the Gulf began to ease, but the situation was far from over. The American Super Hornets maintained a careful escort position for several minutes, ensuring the fighters continued moving away from the carrier strike group. Only once the distance increased beyond several dozen miles did the U.S. pilots receive the order to disengage and return to their patrol zone. One by one, the Super Hornets reduced speed and banked back toward the open waters, where the USS Abraham Lincoln and its escorts continued their steady course. Inside the carrier's command center, the radar tracks slowly separated as the MiG-29s disappeared from the outer edge of the detection range. What had unfolded in the previous minutes was immediately flagged for full analysis. Every modern fighter aircraft records enormous amounts of data during flight, including radar signals, communications, targeting information, and electronic emissions from other aircraft. All of that information would now be reviewed by intelligence officers and tactical analysts. Encounters between military aircraft are not uncommon in regions where rival forces operate close to one another, especially over areas like the Persian Gulf, where several nations maintain strong military presences. However, the maneuvering that had taken place during this incident raised important questions. Analysts aboard the carrier began examining whether the MiG pilots had been conducting a deliberate show of force, a reconnaissance mission, or perhaps a training exercise designed to test how quickly the carrier group would respond. Within an hour, reports of the encounter were transmitted through secure military communication channels to command headquarters. Such incidents are carefully documented because they provide valuable insight into how different air forces operate. The tactics used during the brief maneuvering phase, including the way the MiG formation split and attempted to reposition during the interception, suggested experienced pilots who were comfortable flying in complex tactical environments. Unofficially, several officers aboard the strike group later described the encounter as one of the closest high-speed aerial confrontations they had witnessed in years. While no weapons had been fired and no aircraft were damaged, the combination of aggressive maneuvering and extremely short distances between aircraft meant the margin for error had been dangerously small. At closing speeds common in modern air combat, a single miscalculation could have resulted in a collision or an unintended escalation. By the time the Super Hornets landed back on the carrier's flight deck, the sky above the Gulf had already brightened with the first light of morning. Deck crews moved quickly to secure the aircraft as pilots climbed down from their cockpits, still processing the intensity of the encounter. Debriefings began almost immediately, with pilots describing the maneuvers they had observed and the signals detected by their aircraft systems. In the hours that followed, the carrier strike group quietly resumed its patrol operations. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Ships maintained their formation, radar systems continued scanning the horizon, and aircraft prepared for the next routine mission. But everyone aboard the Abraham Lincoln understood one thing clearly. For a few tense minutes in the early morning sky, a routine patrol had come dangerously close to becoming something far more serious. And in regions where powerful military forces operate within minutes of one another, encounters like this serve as a constant reminder of how quickly the balance between observation and confrontation can shift.